Well, the country worst affected by the coronavirus in Europe is Italy, where infections have jumped by 50% in 24 hours and 52 people have died. The death toll worldwide has now surpassed 3,000, with more than 89,000 infections confirmed. Some of the latest countries to report cases include Azerbaijan, Ecuador, Latvia and Senegal. Iran is experiencing a severe outbreak. 66 people are said to have died from COVID-19, but there are fears that the government there has not reported its true scale. In France, 2 more people have died from the disease, bringing its total to 4. 4 more have been diagnosed with coronavirus in England. They're in Hertfordshire, Devon and Kent. The total for the UK now stands at 40, and all 4 of the new UK cases had travelled to Italy. Chисло has the latest.
Spread diseases, keep it in your handkerchief.
Wash
your hands from national anthem.
The main government advice today, a patriotic washing of hands. As the Prime Minister chaired his first Cobra emergency meeting on the outbreak of coronavirus, he's keen to bat away criticism that the government has been too slow and that he's been absent.
Yeah, I've just chaired a Cobra meeting on coronavirus, and I think it's very important to stress that this is a problem that I think is likely to become more significant for this country in the course of the next days and weeks, and therefore that we've been making every possible preparation for that.
The latest figures show that 40 people in the UK have tested positive, up by 4, including a pupil at this school in Devon. The head teacher said the student is getting all necessary support. And in Maidstone in Kent, a confirmed case forced the local television news studio to close. Across the country, schools, pubs and health centres have temporarily shut to try and stop the spread of the virus. Hindhead Royal British Legion Club is one of the latest places forced to close because of coronavirus fears. We spoke to a woman inside and she said that Public Health England got in touch because one of their members tested positive for the virus. She said that they also sent them instructions on how to do a deep clean themselves. They've been scrubbing away since yesterday, but they're still unclear of when they're going to open. The first confirmed case in Surrey is the type that will cause health authorities the most worry. With no apparent travel history to affected areas or known contact with people who had, he could be the first person to catch the virus within the UK. Worldwide, nearly 90,000 cases have been confirmed and over 3,000 people are known to have died. But more than half of those who caught the virus, over 45,000, have now fully recovered. In China, where it all began, there seems to be more good news. This 98-year-old woman from Wuhan was filmed being discharged from hospital. A vast majority of global cases are still confined to the Hubei province, but in the last 24 hours, there were almost 9 times more new cases reported outside than within mainland China. And President Xi is keen to send the message that his country and their aggressive social control measures are slowly winning the battle against the virus. Away from China, the country with the second highest number of cases in the world, South Korea, their fight is just getting started. Soldiers armed with disinfectant, a daily sight on the streets of Daegu. In Iran, which the World Health Organization are particularly worried about, the official death toll has gone up to 66, but there are concerns that the true figure could be in the hundreds. Closer to home, coronavirus has arrived in every Western European nation. Italy, the hotspot. The death toll there escalated dramatically today to 52 people. But as the virus spreads, life goes on around it. In Israel, having their 3rd election in less than a year, sanitized polling stations made sure that even those under quarantine could get their vote. Politicians still keen to get the numbers they need.
The corona thing is completely under control. Today, we've taken all the precautions that are necessary. People can go and vote with complete confidence.
While people around the world are still figuring out how to cope with the new coronavirus, even world leaders aren't quite so sure. A handshake, an elbow bump, or a pat on the back. A look at how the virus might already be changing the very way we interact.
Well, as we've heard, the largest outbreak in Europe is in Italy. Giuliana D'Antoni returned home to London last week from a vacation in the most affected area in the north. I spoke to her earlier and asked what it had been like in Italy.
The city that I wasn't like considered red zone, but there is a lot of patients on the hospital in that city. And the cities like close by was completely closed. So trains was canceled, or like they cannot receive no one else, or like who is visiting just friends or family cannot get out of the cities too.
And so what happened when you came home to Britain?
I received from my work a notice that I'm supposed to stay at home for about 14 days. And in the meantime, I'm supposed to do the test. And I felt some symptoms like fever or cough. It was a really difficult night. And I called 111, which was really difficult because I spent literally more than an hour on the phone, like holding on the line. And I tried to call many times. And then in the afternoon, they pick up my call. And they say that they ask me about my symptoms, where I have been in Italy. They just came to my place on Saturday. It was a bit funny and scary at the same time because it's like it was looking as a sci-fi film. Like the nurses come here completely covered with the protection uniform. So basically I need to wait for 3 or 4 days to get the results. In the meantime, I'm self-isolating myself. So I share my flat with 2 people, and these 2 people need to stay in a different room than me. So we cannot share the same room, or if we are in the same room, everything needs to be open. We cannot approach ourselves more than 2 meters.
So how do you feel the system has worked for you? I mean, do you feel safe?
No, really, because, you know, it's a long time that I'm waiting for the results, or like also for they come here, and when you call they have a lot, like it's so long the holding line, like you need to wait for a long time to they finally pick up your call. So, you know, in the meantime, I think you feel nervous because you want to go out, because at the end you need to hold your job, and all these things like make yourself a bit stressful. But it's like you are waiting for something that you're not 100% sure, and you depend on it like to keep going your life. I'm working remotely, but at some point I think also for human being, you need to go out of your home or interact with your flatmates or something like this. So I need to wait until Thursday to have any results, if yes or no. In the meantime, I need to wait.
Well, good luck. I hope it goes well.
Thank you very much.
Well, we asked the Health Secretary to appear on the programme, but we were told he was not available. But I am joined now by Neil Dixon, the Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, which represents hospitals and NHS bodies, and Dr Helena McCorn, a GP who's chair of the British Medical Association. Dr Helena McCorn, first, just to get you to respond to what we've just heard from Giuliana D'Antoni there. She waited a long while for NHS 111 to respond, and she still hasn't got her test results. Is that a fairly typical picture, do you think? Does NHS 111 have the resources?
We have heard at the British Medical Association that there is quite a long time for some patients to wait for NHS 111, and I'm really sorry for Giuliana waiting for the result as well. My understanding is over the last few days, more members of NHS 111 have been drafted in to do extra hours to reduce this wait, and there's also a way that you can email NHS 111. But I would really urge that people are patient and do continue to do that, because that's part of how we will contain this, and containment is still a very real possibility.
Well, Neil Dixon, we get the government's battle plan, in inverted commas, tomorrow. What is the worst-case scenario that you're preparing for?
Well, there's an escalation plan, clearly, and one has to emphasise we are still in a containment phase. I think one of the concerns, obviously, is there are 2 people that we know of who we are not sure where they got it. It seems to have been intra-Britain transmission, and that is a matter of concern, trying to trace them. The other cases are less of concern because we've managed to trace, we know where where they got the virus in the first place. So I think the answer is that they will announce tomorrow, and I haven't seen the detail of it, an escalation plan. And that's what the NHS is normally geared up for. So as more cases come in, then of course routine operations may have to be put off. Clearly that the routine clinics, anything that really can be deferred, will be deferred, depending on the level of pressure. New wards will be created in order to deal with patients who need treatment,
in
as it were.
hospitals or in schools?
No, in hospitals, that's where people will be treated if they are vulnerable and they need that special kind of treatment. The good news, again, about this virus is that for the vast majority of people, it's a relatively trivial illness. That actually makes it more difficult to detect as well. But it does mean that for most people, except the most vulnerable, then it isn't so much of a problem.
How worried are you when you hear that? How worried are you? Is this something you're playing down, or are you concerned that the NHS might be brought to its knees by this?
I'm very worried because I'm aware that if you go to an emergency department, if you go into a hospital, if you try and get a routine appointment with your general practitioner, that the service is what I would consider 99% full already. It is good to hear from Neil that there are spaces in hospitals that could be turned into wards. However, I'm very concerned by the NHS staff survey only 10 days ago that 56% of our NHS staff already go into work unwell, and I cannot ask people to be doing that now because that would potentially spread illness, and that the NHS already is causing stress in 40% of our workers.
And you talk about more wards. I mean, in Wuhan, they built a whole series of new hospitals. Are you confident that in a worst-case scenario, which suggested that 1 in 10 people could be hospitalised, do you have enough critical care beds in NHS England?
No, there will eventually come a time, if the virus absolutely takes hold everywhere, where, of course, the NHS will then have to prioritise further. But we are...
What does that mean, though, in practice?
Well, that means in practice that you will say, for example, that you will be treating, you'll prioritise your patients. So the most vulnerable patients will get treatment. Those who are less vulnerable are less likely to be treated. That is the normal situation in which the NHS would normally deal in any crisis situation. And
does that mean more people will die, though, without wishing to be alarmist?
Well, it is inevitable that if this virus comes big time, then significant numbers of people will die, just as they die from regular flu every year. But I do think it is important, first of all, to recognise the NHS is under enormous strain at the moment. Virtually every hospital is full at the moment. But what the NHS is good at is flexing so that it will then choose the most ill people and keep them in hospital. Those who are less ill or those who are coming in for routine operations won't need it. That will create space in order to treat those who will need treatment. At some point, of course, it may be that there are just too many people requiring that form of treatment.
When you look at the figures for NHS England, there were only 1,000 critical care beds available in December. Is there a case, do you think, for making hospital beds available elsewhere, schools, requisitioning schools and turning them into hospitals?
Not necessarily, but what really worries me is why do we have a quarter of the number of intensive beds that Germany have, which is a similar economy?
Can you answer that?
No, I think we do need more intensive care beds. The reality is that the healthcare system has been consistently underfunded for a long period of time, and only in recent times has sufficient more investment being put in. But even that level of investment, I think, leaves us a long way to catch up in order to be able to provide the kind of services we need.
So really, this pandemic, if it becomes a pandemic, has come at the worst possible time.
Well, I worry about my patients who come in to see me who might be care workers on 0-hour contracts. I know already that if they don't go out to see vulnerable patients in their homes, they may not have the money to buy food for their children. This is underinvestment coming home to roost in both the healthcare and the social care service.
The Prime Minister says that schools and public places will be closed on scientific advice. What would your advice be to him about when that should be done to prevent the spread of this? You're clearly worried about the implications of widespread spread. How nip it in the bud?
Well, I'm not a clinician, so I would absolutely rely on clinical advice as to when those measures should be taken. There's no doubt there's quite a lot that people individually can do at the moment. And I would say, just in relation to 111, that there is now an online version, and that is a better form of, and you're likely to get a better answer more quickly.
Well, you are a clinician, so your very quick response to that. When do you close schools and public places?
So I will listen to the Chief Medical Officer regarding schools, but my GP practices, my colleagues there need to be treated as professionals and allowed to make decisions about when they close down things like direct access to face-to-face appointments. So you do need to allow GP practices to make those decisions based on their knowledge.
Dr. Helena McCorn and Neil Dixon, thank you both very much. Chris.
Well, Ryanair has become the latest airline to cancel flights due to a drop in demand caused by the virus. The Dublin-based carrier said it's reducing frequencies on some routes by up to 25%. British Airways and EasyJet have also cancelled a number of flights. However, there was some relief for stock markets today after central banks, including the Bank of England, indicated they're prepared to step in to support the global economy. Our Washington correspondent Siobhan Kennedy joins us now from the New York Stock Exchange. Siobhan, what's the latest?
Well, Christian, there is some welcome green on the screens, as you can see all around me here, as all the major stock indices have really rallied today after the carnage that we saw in markets last week. It was the worst week for markets since the financial crisis of 2008, all on fears, really, that the coronavirus would lead to a global economic slowdown. Now, those fears haven't gone away. There is still much uncertainty, but investors, as you said there, have taken some comfort from central banks around the world, from the Bank of England, from the Bank of Japan, and from the Federal Reserve here in New York, that they stand to step in to boost markets and to prop up their economies if things look like they could be getting worse. And I have to say, in the short term, it does look like things could continue to get worse. That certainly seems to be one scenario painted by the economic think tank, the OECD, which said if there was a more intensive, it said, outbreak of the virus, then that could see global growth halve this year to about 1.5%. In terms of numbers here in the US, there are now 91 cases. The first case announced right here in New York last night, and there have been 2 deaths so far. Well, earlier I caught up with some of the traders here and I asked them what it would take to cause another panic sell-off. Here's what they had to say.
Expansion. We continue to see the headlines that have identified the coronavirus in certain countries. Now we're seeing it in certain states in the United States. And if we continue to see that expansion, I think that's when we'll get another round of fear. I also think we'll get another round of fear if the U.S. government steps in and gets involved and starts shutting down governmental offices or certain aspects of our day in and day out life, whether it's mass transit and stuff like that. I think that's when we'll see another line of fear.
I would imagine the cases will ramp up and hopefully the mortality rate decreases to where we can find some kind of belief that this isn't as bad as we thought and the panic would be over. But we still have a lot of volatility. Up 3% is still volatile times. So I would think that someone, if they're not truly knowledgeable of the markets, it's a scary time to invest, whether it's up or down.
Traders here making the point that central banks could help to stabilise the situation here, but this isn't a financial crisis. Money isn't the cure here. It's a vaccine that will be the cure. That is why Donald Trump is using a scheduled meeting with the drug companies today to push them to speed up the delivery of a vaccine. But we know still that that is a good year to a year and a half away. We know that he is desperate for the economy to be buoyed again. He is very much pinned the future of his successful re-election campaign on a strong economy. So he will no doubt be happy to see these strings here behind me turn green. But the traders, don't forget, are cautioning that it will take several days of consistent calm, consistent green screens to be able to declare that this panic for now is over.
Thanks, Siobhan. Well, joining me now from Paris is Laurence Boone, Chief Economist at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, that has been making these predictions. Could you just tell us what's the basis of them? What are you assuming the scale of an outbreak would be in order to cause a halving of global growth? And where would that halving come from? What would be hit?
So, as you know, there's a lot of uncertainty about this health episode and how the epidemic is being translated through countries. So we have a base scenario, which is a base case scenario, which is based on the situation as it is roughly today. So most of the epidemic contained in China and some clusters everywhere. And with this scenario, we actually project growth, global growth, to be about 2.4% this year. Now, given the uncertainty that's prevalent about how the virus is spreading, we have also drawn a downside scenario where the epidemic would be roughly similar, or I should say the measures to contain the epidemic would be roughly similar to China, but in North America, in Europe, and in the rest of the Northern Hemisphere, so Asia Pacific. And in that case, we have GDP growth, which is half to 1.5%. And we have these two scenarios because there's a lot of uncertainty and we're trying to provide a range of what's possible. And then the policy that would address this range of possible downturn.
And so which are the industries or sectors that would be hit by a large-scale coronavirus pandemic?
So the sectors which are hit are first tourism and business travel and student tourism as well. Then you have everything which has a production chain that's deeply integrated with China. So you can think about the automobile sector. There's obviously the computer and electronic equipment sector. For example, the US produces about 20% of the computer and electronic equipment, and for that 24% of its inputs are coming from China. And there's also the pharmaceutical sector.
And so in order to get to 1.5% global growth, I know we're concentrating on the downside here, but presumably some countries would be in recession in that scenario. Which countries do you think you'd be looking at with shrinking economies?
So if we were to reach the downside scenario, we would see effectively a cut in our projection for regions like Europe or Japan, and in North America would be closer to zero.
And would some be negative?
Yeah, in Europe and in Japan, we would probably have a negative number. That's true. But again, this is, a range with a downside scenario. One thing that we haven't talked about is this is not a worst case scenario, because in our downside scenario, we don't include a outbreak in the southern hemisphere.
Right. So it could be much worse, actually. You could be looking at global shrinkage if it's spread all around the world. I mean, for Britain's point of view, we are also in a post-Brexit scenario, entering trade talks. Does this put us in a strong position to be able to plough our own course, or a weak position?
So there are a couple of things. I think there was some relief after Brexit was agreed last year. So we would have seen a slightly higher first quarter this year, prior to the coronavirus episode. At the same time, when the world is the type of containment measure that we have are constraining trade, obviously, because you've got less production, supply chain disrupted. And trade growth last year was negative. And in both our scenario, the base case and the downside scenario, trade growth is also negative. And Britain, as you know very well, is a very open economy, so it will be affected by this downturn in trade.
So do you think Britain would be worse off than the rest of Europe?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying, what we project in our base case scenario for the UK is 0.8% GDP growth. In the downside scenario, when we have Europe plunging by about 1.2 below our baseline, then the UK would also get close to zero.
Laurence Boone, thank you very much indeed.